And welcome back. All right, we're going to hit Japan here, finish up World War II. I got about 30 slides. Try to knock that out as quickly as possible for you guys so I don't keep you here too long. So when we left last time, we just had finished the war in Europe, and the Allies and the Americans, the British, the French, and the Russians had marched across Germany and met in the middle there, right? And now we have to figure out a way to finish off the Japanese. And the Japanese are a totally different animal. So it's not, I don't, totally different mindset, I suppose, than the Germans. And if you want to, you can click on this link. It shows you. It's pretty disturbing images. It's from the island of Saipan, where Japanese civilians choose to kill themselves instead of be taken prisoners by American military troops. And so like I kind of picked that video just to show the resolve of the Japanese people and what America is facing as they try to end the war with Japan, and they try to defeat someone that's already been defeated. And so like we had discussed earlier in the chapter before Pearl Harbor that the Japanese motive was to grab as much land as possible and sue for peace and try to keep as much land as they could. And that would work if your opponent wasn't fighting until they reached something they're going to refer to as unconditional surrender. And because the Americans have decided that they're going to fight until they reach unconditional surrender, there's no concessions for the Japanese. And so the Japanese propose different ideas, and they're all rejected because it's either you totally surrender and get rid of the emperor, and you remain accountable for your actions, or this keeps going. Okay, and so it just keeps going. And so ultimately, there's two paths of advance towards Japan. There's the path that's going to be led by the Navy, which is Admiral Chester Nimitz, and he's going to come directly across the Pacific with his fleet. The second one is going to be General Douglas MacArthur, that's going to advance from Japan, from New Guinea and the Philippines, and move up that way. Both are island hopping. Probably the one that's going to be most of those two, MacArthur's going to be the most famous. But all right. And so the United States is going to attack new islands that have been previously taken, and then use those islands that have been taken as bases for the next one. And so in 1943, we take Guadalcanal and the Gilbert Islands, and in 44, we take the Marshall Islands and the Saipan, which is the Mariana Islands. And there's air bases on those islands, and those air bases are close enough that we can launch B-29s towards Japan and attack them. And so we look here, there's the Battle of Midway, which we talked about. There's Hawaii. This is the extent of the Japanese Empire at its height in May of 1942. Battle of Coral Reef happens down there. We discussed that. Then you have Guadalcanal, which is the first island on the island hopping, then the Solomon Islands, and the Gilbert Islands, and then the Marshall Islands and the Marlena Islands, which is going to be Guam and whatnot. And then we're eventually going to take Iwo Jima. We'll take Iwo Jima, and then we will take one of the islands off of the coast of Japan as well. And that will be the start to the end of the war. But once we reach Guam, we have land bases that are now close enough where B-29 bombers can fly to Japan and return. In October of 1944, Douglas MacArthur, who was originally general of the forces in the Philippines, and in 1941-42 had to be removed from the Philippines to ensure that he wasn't captured by the Japanese. Had made a promise that he would return to the Philippines and liberate them, and he fulfills that promise with his military in October 1944. And the Japanese are trying their best to hold on to as much land as they can, or at least make it as costly for America to gain land as they possibly can. And we fight the largest naval battle of the war, which is off of the coast of the Philippines. It's called the Battle of Lake Gulf. And this basically just wipes out the Japanese fleet. They're overpowered. The Americans have rebuilt the ships from Pearl Harbor. They've repaired those ships. They've built new ships. They're just the might of Detroit and Philadelphia and San Francisco and all of the American industrial cities is just bearing down on Japan, and Japan can't keep up. The Battle of Lake Gulf is the first time that the Japanese army starts to use kamikaze pilots to attack and kamikaze is the Japanese word for divine wind. And basically, by the end of the war, the kamikazes had damaged about 300 ships and killed 1,500 servicemen. But that's not really a huge number when you look at the total number of service people and ships in the war. And because of this, the kamikaze attacks are really almost more psychological than anything, where they're just showing the Americans how prepared they are to fight to the very end. Divine Wind, the Mongols were coming to invade Japan in the 1300s, and there was a tsunami that came and wiped them out, and that's the meaning behind the word ultimately. But after Lake Gulf and the appearance of the kamikaze pilots, the Japanese Navy is really damaged to the point where it's not much of a force to be reckoned with at that point. Not only are we fighting off the islands in Japan, but we're also fighting to liberate places like Burma and Vietnam and Laos and Cambodia. And we're also not just fighting by ourselves. Really, anybody that's an enemy of the Japanese is going to be an ally of the Americans. And so we have this situation where the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And probably no better example of this is going to be Ho Chi Minh in French Indochina, or in Vietnam, or Mao Zedong in China, who both go on to be communist leaders in their respective areas, and ultimately become very powerful adversaries of the United States government. But during World War II, we spent a lot of time supplying, Ho Chi Minh and his troops with supplies to fight the Japanese in Vietnam. We give Mao Zedong tons of money and supplies to fight the Japanese in China as well. And so by 1945, the Japanese just are to the point where the war is over. They don't have the ability to continue fighting. They don't have the resources to feed their people. They don't have the capacity to mount a counteroffensive. But the Japanese just won't quit. The American naval blockade had been relatively successful in shutting down supplies from coming in and out of Japan. The American bombing raids on Japan have been very, very costly by this point. By 1945, the Japanese are really in a losing situation, but they just will not surrender. And the idea of the Japanese is really to just make every victory for the Americans so costly that eventually they will agree to some conditions in terms of surrender. And as the battles get closer and closer to mainland Japan, the body counts for the American wounded or dead begin to skyrocket. An example of that is the island of Iwo Jima, which is on our map here. It's in between Japan and the Marianas. Excuse me. Ooh. Okay, it's in between Japan and the Marianas. Iwo Jima was really important to the Americans because it had a air base, and so when a B-29 would fly from, let's say, Guam to Japan and drop a payload, and they want to return, if that plane was injured or crippled in any way going into Japan or off of that raid, the Americans would want to land it in Iwo Jima. And so the Americans want it for that reason. The Japanese want it as a lookout station and the ability to warn mainland Japan of upcoming attacks. Iwo Jima is interesting because it has a series of underground bunkers, and the Japanese put up a horrible resistance to the American troops. Where they refuse to surrender. They go into these caves and launch counter kind of terrorist attacks against the Americans behind enemy lines. And ultimately, the Americans would go into these caves and either like close them up like with a bulldozer and push tons and tons of gravel and dirt, and starve the combatants in the cave, or they would take a flamethrower and fire huge amounts of flame into the cave, so it would steal out of the oxygen. In the Battle of Iwo Jima, the Americans take more losses than in the Battle of Normandy, than in the D-Day invasion. Probably the most famous of all Marine pictures happened here with the raising of the flag at Iwo Jima. I think there's 5 guys, and out of that 5, only 3 of them survive the rest of the battle. And so it's very costly for the Americans. And the American planners start to wonder, hey, well, what are we going to have to do to get the Japanese to call it quits? And we have the Battle of Okinawa, which is eventually going to end. It's 350 miles off the coast of Japan. This is the bloodiest battle that's going to take place in the Pacific. Over 12,000 Americans lose their lives, which again is more than is going to die. More Americans are going to die in the Battle of Okinawa than are going to die in Iwo Jima. More Americans are going to die in Okinawa than die in the Battle of Normandy, the liberation of France for D-Day. And over 100,000 Japanese are going to lose their lives. And so the Americans are not only losing, they're not only winning territory, they're winning this body count. But every step of the way is more costly. And so again, the Americans begin to wonder how, if we do have to invade Japan and put boots on the ground in the nation of Japan, what's that going to look like? Are we going to be fighting all the Japanese soldiers? Are we going to be fighting Japanese soldiers plus civilians? Is everybody going to fight to the death? Is there any hope of surrender at all? And what are those death tolls going to look like? I've seen I've seen projections of somewhere in the neighborhood of between 2 to 5 million American casualties were expected if we did have to invade Japan. Right around this time, so around April of 1945, as the war is coming to an end in Europe, the Americans are going to develop an incendiary bomb, which is a predecessor to napalm, and it's a bomb that will catch fire as it lands. It catches fire and spreads fire to every surface it touches. And America begins to not only use this in Europe but also in Japan. So we go into to Tokyo one night, and you're going to read about this in the assignments. We go into Tokyo and we launched actually with one of the deadliest bombing raids in all of the war. We killed more people in Tokyo with a fire bombing rate than we kill with the atomic bomb. And an individual atomic bomb. And so we burned down somewhere in the neighborhood of half of the city of Tokyo, and kill over 100,000 people there. Okay, so while all that is going on, the United States is trying to develop an atomic weapon, and Germany is trying to develop an atomic weapon, and Britain's trying to develop an atomic weapon, and we're working to do that. In 1938, we have an Austrian physicist that finds a way to split an atom, which gives us a burst of energy. And this energy, if this energy could be harnessed, it could create some sort of an atomic bomb. And so many scientists who flee the Nazi regime in Germany end up in the United States. they start to talk to the higher up in the scientific community in America and encourage America to start trying to establish some kind of an atomic bomb program. Albert Einstein is influential in this, and the fact that he meets with Roosevelt and discusses the creation of an atomic program. The code name for our atomic program was the Manhattan Project. Each section of the Manhattan Project happened individually and unbeknownst to anybody else. There's actually possibilities that you could be working on the Manhattan Project and have no idea what you were doing. It was so compartmentalized that very few people actually knew what was going on. You had research facilities in Chicago and Philadelphia and Tennessee, Los Angeles. You had testing facilities in Los Alamos, New Mexico, and ultimately on July 16th, 1945, the first atomic bomb is successfully tested in the New Mexico desert. And so Truman ultimately has to make a decision. Are we going to invade Japan, or are we going to use the atomic weapon? And I think one of the things that we do poorly in history is we apply modern understanding to situations of the past. Well, Truman doesn't really have much of a decision here. He doesn't. I don't know if Truman truly understands what he's deciding. He has the opportunity to end the war with a huge new weapon, right? Something that nobody's ever seen before, or he's going to order somewhere in the neighborhood of 1 million to 2 million to 5 million American soldiers to their death. And so, of course, the decision is to use the atomic weapon. Truman sends a letter to the Japanese telling them that if they don't surrender, they're going to face prompt and utter destruction. This is about the same time that the Americans are using the incendiary bombs, so the Japanese are a little bit confused on what he means by that, and they don't respond. On August 6th, the Americans drop an atomic bomb on Hiroshima and basically destroy the city, killing somewhere in the neighborhood of 80,000 people in the blast and maybe upwards of 200,000 through radiation. The mushroom cloud is somewhere in the neighborhood of 50,000 feet high when it explodes. And this is the introduction of humanity into the atomic age. Even with this destruction, the Japanese don't surrender, and it's not until August 8th, which was relatively sooner than expected, that the Russians declare war on Japan, making sure that if the Japanese do surrender, that they're going to get a piece of the spoils. And on August 9th, America drops our second atomic bomb on Nagasaki, and we destroy that city. On the 14th, the Japanese announced plans to surrender to the Japanese people. The emperor talks about the horrors of the Americans and their cruelty and what they would do, and then to the soldiers, the emperor conveys a message about basically fighting the Russians, and it was too much, and there was nothing they could do. And on September 2nd, 1945, Japan signs its surrender aboard the USS Missouri, and that's going to bring us to the end of the Second World War. After the war, the world's going to enter into this new era, which is going to be dominated by the Americans and the Soviet Union. World War I is devastating. World War II is devastating squared, I would suppose. Somewhere in the neighborhood of 40 to 60 million people are going to die. A vast majority of them are going to be civilians. You're going to have entire populations of Russian towns and Russian provinces wiped out through German cruelty, and then you're going to have the same thing happen with Germany. America is going to drop atomic bombs and kill somewhere in the neighborhood of 80 to 200,000 people. The Chinese are going to lose between 2 and 15 million people through Japanese cruelty. The war industry, you're going to see somewhere in the neighborhood of like 3 million workplace injuries and 100,000 casualties to the point where they can't work anymore. As the Allies begin to liberate areas of Eastern Europe. They stumble upon these death camps that the Germans had established to eliminate Jewish people, or of people of Jewish heritage and Jewish faith. Probably the most famous of these is going to be Auschwitz, which is in Poland. The Allies are going to roll into here, liberate these camps, and try to keep these people alive as much as we can. But it just shows the cruelty and the lack of respect for life by the Nazis. We talk about the Jews who tried to flee Germany in the late 1930s, found that not many countries wanted to take them. Most countries had some kind of a immigration limit due to the Depression. During times of economic troubles, you don't necessarily want to encourage lots of people to move to your country. And so by 1939, by the start of the war, there's 250,000 Jews left in Germany, and of those Jews that were able to get out, a vast majority of them moved into Eastern Europe, and would face persecution and death as the Nazi war machine gains more ground in places like Poland and Russia. Dachau, Auschwitz. These are probably the two most famous of the death camps. They would have the camp prisoners operate things like the crematoriums and whatever. In Auschwitz, it was estimated that the Nazis could kill somewhere in the neighborhood of 12,000 people a day. It's difficult to wrap your mind around. The Nazis are going to kill somewhere in the neighborhood of 12 million people. 6 million of those are going to be Jewish. This is about a third of the world's Jewish population at that time. Most World War II Nazis are arrested and tried for their war crimes, tried for crimes about the Holocaust, tried for crimes against humanity, in which, the Nazis would do experiments on people to see how if you could free somebody to death and then bring him back to life, and or would try the Nazis that were in charge at the death camps like Auschwitz. 12 of the 24 Nazis tried in Nuremberg were sentenced to death, and 6 of the Japanese generals were sentenced there as well for cruelty to crimes against humanity, basically. The takeaway from the Nuremberg trials, which is what we're talking about here, is that ultimately individuals are responsible for their own actions. And so even though they were following orders from higher up, they're responsible for their own actions. Following World War II, the two main superpowers of the world are going to be the United States and the Soviet Union. It will be different than the First World War, because after World War I, the United States returns back to this period of isolationism. Following World War II, America is going to become very active in world affairs. And we're going to enter into what we're going to refer to as the Cold War, in which both the United States and the Soviet Union battle with each other for economic and political influence over Europe and other areas and markets. The United Nations is going to be formed in July of 1945. It's still around. It's in New York City. It's used as an international peacekeeping organization, or if nations have issues with each other, they can bring them to the UN, and it's a way to avoid conflict and armed conflict, and try to negotiate a peaceful resolution to troubles between nations. Get that there, and that's kind of where we are. And so I hope we enjoyed that. You got something out of World War II, and come back and we'll knock out the Cold War, and we'll be done with our 8-week session. So thank you very much, and we'll see you next time.